Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off with the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, last week, we began the month of December with a little bit of a change of course. The month of December, we're going to look at the Christmas story. And last week, we started off by looking at this whole question of the difference between the message of the Christmas story and really the message of ancient gods and things like that during that time period, the Roman gods or the Greek gods or things like that. And we talked about those differences. This week what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the very worst conspiracy theories that unfortunately have gained a lot of traction online, and really kind of look at them briefly and just walk through the problems with those theories at a very high level. Next week, what we're going to do as we get closer to Christmas, we're actually going to talk about the differences between the accounts in Matthew and the account in Luke. Two different versions of the same event from two different perspectives. And we'll talk about it. It makes perfect sense once you look at it and actually read what the text says, as opposed to the Hollywood version that we're all kind of used to. And then finally, on Christmas morning, we're just simply going to look at the Christmas story. And we're going to read through the traditional Christmas story from Luke and just look at what it means for each one of us. So in this week's podcast, we're going to talk about some of the more wild conspiracy theories out there, and there are some real doozies when you look at them. I want to be clear when we talk about this, and I think it's important that we use good documentation and we walk through where things come from. There's a lot of untruths on the internet, and the irony is not lost on me, given that that's where you're finding this content is on the internet. But it's important to look for well-sourced documentation, and a lot of these conspiracy theories have been debunked over 100 years ago by mainstream academia and are no longer considered. These theories are so far outside of the mainstream norm that nobody really talks about them anymore except on the internet because they've been so discredited. And I think you'll understand a little bit more why when we get in and talk about them. So let's jump in tonight, and we're going to start with the very first one. It's one that we've talked about before. A lot of these ideas base themselves around this concept that Jesus was not a real person, that Jesus was a mythical being, just like Hercules or Zeus or any others, and that there is no historical evidence for Jesus. Now, the amazing thing is, many people who come to this conclusion start by taking all of the historical evidence for Jesus and throwing it out, and then claiming after they've done that there is no historical evidence for Jesus. It's an interesting tactic. It's not true, but it's an interesting tactic. So let's talk about tonight why we know that Jesus was a real person. And let's start at the top. Number one, there are 4 gospel accounts of his life. Now, we think of the Bible as one book, and it is. But it's not one book written by one author like we think about. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit, obviously. But there are multiple different authors. And the Bible is written over the course of 1,500 years. The New Testament, there are 4 different accounts of the gospel narrative. And each one of those 4 accounts is written by a different person. You know, one of the things a lot of critics point to and focus on are differences between the 4 gospels. Well, there's 4 individual books that make up the 4 Gospels. You also have the book of Acts, which details the growth of the early church. You have the letters that contained after that, and the book of Revelation. So the New Testament itself is made up of multiple different stories written by multiple different authors. Each one of them stands on their own. And each one of them, all 4 of the Gospels, claim to be written either by A, eyewitnesses, and this is going to be important, or B, they claim to be written by people who talked to and interviewed the eyewitnesses, people who were there. The gospel narratives stand on their own. And for those who claim, well, you can't trust the Bible because it's biased, I want you to think about that for a minute. And I know I've mentioned this before. The gospel writers, in many cases, went to their death professing that what they were saying was the truth, that Jesus had died, that he had died stating he was dying for the sins of mankind, that he was buried in a tomb, and on the 3rd day, God supernaturally raised him from the dead. Now, the claims that the Bible is biased are pointing directly at those individuals who are saying they were there and these things happened. If you say that they were biased, it lends credibility to what they were biased by. These aren't people who lived hundreds of years later and wrote down something that they heard. These are people who lived then, who said, this is what I saw. This is what the people I interviewed saw. And they believed it so much, they went to their graves professing the truth of it. So when you say they were biased, that lends credence to what they said they saw. Not what they heard, but what they saw. So we have the 4 gospel accounts. We also have the writings of the early church fathers. And the early church fathers requote the gospel messages, but they also reinforce them. And I want to quote from Eusebius. I love this quote. It's one we've talked about, I think, before. That says, "The works of our Savior were always present, for they were true. Those who were healed, those who rose from the dead," that's multiple, "those who were not only seen in the act of being healed or raised, but were also always present, not merely when the Savior was living on the earth, but also for a considerable time after his departure, so that some of them survived even to our own times." What he's talking about there is people like Bartimaeus, who was healed from being blind from birth. People like Lazarus, who were raised from the dead. Jairus' daughter had been raised from the dead. People who had been miraculously healed, who became followers, and then it was their testimony and the testimony of the disciples that helped grow the early church. These people didn't just simply disappear. This is how the early church grew. It was people like Bartimaeus who said, "I was blind from birth, and Jesus healed my eyes. And I walked with him from that day going forward, and I witnessed all these other things." So it was eyewitness testimony that grew the early church, but it's the eyewitness testimony that we also fall back on. A great book Richard Bauckham wrote called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. In Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he talks about how the gospel authors identified the people that they interviewed, the people who had witnessed these things. It's an amazing read, but it walks through that very process. Number 3, we have Paul letters and the creeds of the early church. And the most famous of those being the creed from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which Christian scholarship and even skeptics will tell you goes back to the earliest years of the church, if not the earliest months of the church, following Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. These early creeds indicate to us the story didn't change. From the very beginning, the story was that Jesus died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, and rose from the dead. And these creeds came to us from the early church and were quoted by Paul in his letters. So throughout the early church, we have support for the fact that Jesus was a real person. But we also have support outside the Bible as well. We have the Talmud, which would be the writings from the Jewish leadership of that time. And the Talmud actually talks about Jesus, and it actually talks about the fact that he was a miracle worker. Now, it attributes those miracles to the fact that Jesus was some kind of an evil sorcerer or something like that. But it actually talks about Jesus, and it actually directly talks about the miracles that he performed, that he was known to be a miracle worker. That's not friendly testimony. Again, this was the group who had put Jesus to death. And so they're not going to be out there saying what a great guy he was, and they're certainly not going to make up somebody who didn't exist. We also have the Jewish historian Josephus. And Josephus has 2 very notable quotes about Jesus. One that talks about Jesus directly, and another, and this one I think is equally important, if not more so in this context. The other quote where he talks about Jesus being a real person, he's talking about the death of Jesus' brother James the Just. And James, leader of the Christian church, when he is stoned to death and killed, when James is killed, he uses Jesus as a reference to help you identify who James was. He points to Jesus as being the more famous person and says, "Hey, James, the brother of Jesus." Because he knows his audience will know who Jesus was. And when he says, "Hey, it's Jesus, this was his brother James who died," his audience goes, "Oh, okay, we know who that was." And it helps them identify, and it links those things together. We see that done frequently in our own culture quite often. Same thing happens here. So not only does Josephus quote Jesus, and not only does Josephus mention Jesus, but he does so in a way that indicates to the reader, hey, Jesus was famous, you know who he was, this was his brother, in a way to roundabout talk about that. That's critically important when we look at this. And finally, and I'm going to stop here, there are other outside sources as well, But the Roman historian Tacitus, I talked about him last week, but again, Tacitus not only confirms for us, as does Josephus, that Jesus was a real person, they both also confirm for us that he died by crucifixion. And Tacitus directly points to that it was Pontius Pilate who did it. We have plenty of confirmation that Jesus was a real person. You can't say that Jesus was not a real person and throw out all the evidence without doing so to every person throughout history. There can be no recorded history. If you're gonna go to this level, we basically throw out all history in an effort to get rid of Jesus. And that's just foolhardy. Even Bart Ehrman, and I hate to mention Bart Ehrman, but who is an agnostic, leaning atheist critic of Christianity, even Bart Ehrman says it's just foolish to claim that Jesus was not a real person. So the idea that Jesus wasn't a real person is kind of foundational to a lot of these ideas out there. Again, around the internet, the movie Zeitgeist and other internet publications and things like that. When you see these things, these conspiracy theories that run online, a lot of them have a foundation that Jesus wasn't a real person, and there's just no historical basis for saying that. So that's kind of number one. Number one, Jesus was absolutely a real person, and honestly, from this point forward, we're really not going to talk a lot about it because it hardly warrants mentioning. The idea is so far outside of the mainstream, it's really not worth spending a lot of time on discussing. But just to be fair, the second idea that really gets a lot of publication, especially through things like Zeitgeist and things like that, is this idea that, well, the stories of Jesus, he wasn't a real person, and the stories of him are kind of amalgamated stories of all of these other fictional gods who existed before him, gods with a little g. And they try to pull this together and make a comparison between the two. And we talked a little bit last week about the differences between the story of Christmas and the story of these other ancient gods and how very different that they are. Nobody ever claimed to have gone to a wedding with Hercules or to have been his buddy or see him die and raise from the dead. Nobody believed that. Again, we've talked about N.T. Wright's quote when we talked about the resurrection. The ancient world absolutely did not believe that people raised from the dead. It was just something that was not believed. But is there this idea that ancient gods raised from the dead and that they stole this idea about Jesus from that? Let's briefly talk about this and just kind of walk through it. Now, a lot of these ideas were popularized, again, back in the 1800s. A lot of weird things that came out of the 1800s, but this, again, came out of the 1800s, and this idea has been discredited for over 100 years in mainstream academia. And again, it's found new life on the internet. When you look at a lot of the documentation on these things, a lot of the documentation goes back to things that are over 100 years old, back to before this stuff was discredited. And beyond that, a lot of it doesn't directly point to the actual documentation that you would expect to see as a primary source document. If you're looking at something that, supposedly happened in ancient Egypt, you're going to want to see, is there documentation from ancient Egyptian sources that support this kind of thing? And what we're going to largely find is there's just none of that out there, or the similarities between Jesus' story and these other figures are just so slim. They're really invisible. They're just not there. And so let's talk about a few of them to kind of walk through this. Remember, the difference between the two could not be more vast. What made Judaism and Christianity different from all of the ancient worship back 2,000 years ago, and Paul brought this point up when he was addressing the crowd on Mars Hill in Athens back in the book of Acts. The difference could not have been more profound. There were no similarities between them. Nobody claimed that we should be following Zeus's moral code. Again, Zeus is responsible for half the pregnancies in the ancient world if you read through the ancient literature. Nobody thinks Zeus is a great moral character to follow in all of this. It's like a bad soap opera. So when you look at this, what set Christianity apart, what set Judaism apart, was this idea of a firm moral code and the claim of absolute godhood above and beyond everything. So there's not this happy, squishy middle ground. And this idea that somehow the early church basically stole a bunch of ideas from these ancient gods and brought them in. Before we talk in detail about some of this, I want you to think about that for a minute. So ancient god worship back 2,000 years ago, when you're going down to the temple and engaging in intercourse with a temple prostitute or something like that, when you're sacrificing to these ancient gods with a little g, there's nothing in this with any similarity to the claims that are made by Judaism and Christianity. And if you look at that and say, well, Christians clearly stole these ideas and just made Jesus into this, you need to continue on with the statement. And in doing so, what they did with the story that they made up with Jesus was get themselves persecuted by the Roman Empire, persecuted by everybody else out there, because they picked something so very different and dissimilar that it infuriated everybody else. And you see where this idea starts to break down. If you're going to make up something like this, if it's untrue, then why in the world would you make something up that's going to get you persecuted and killed by the Roman Empire? The Romans were good at persecuting people. They had no trouble killing someone. So why would you do that? If you're going to make up a new god, you're going to make up a god that gets you money, that gets you power, that gets you fame, that gets you all sorts of awful things. And it's not hard to do. If you pick the most popular god at the time and you just double down on the worship of whatever that god is doing, it would be pretty easy to do. But what you're not going to do is claim something that gets you beaten, impoverished, and ultimately murdered by the Roman Empire. The claim that they stole all of these ideas and created a new god out of them in Jesus defies logic when you look at what they did, what they claimed, and what ultimately happened. So on one hand, we're supposed to believe that they're these incredibly evil people who made up this lie. And on the other hand, they're so incompetent that they did so in such a way that it got them all killed. You can't have it both ways. If they were really evil and maniacal and conniving and doing all of these things, then they would have cooked up something that was popular, something that would have gained them something other than a painful death. So again, you can't have this both ways. But let's kind of break a few of these down. I think one of the most famous is Horus. And so this idea that, well, the story of Jesus was really stolen from the story of the Egyptian god Horus, and maybe to some degree the Egyptian god Osiris or something like that. So going back to the original documentation, and again, I want to call out Mike Winger on his YouTube page for the research that he's done on this. I also want to call out a paper's done by Mary Jo Sharp, does the story of Jesus mimic pagan mystery stories, and then Mark Foreman's paper, Challenging the Zeitgeist Movie. Those are papers from the book Come Let Us Reason. I'll put that in as source documentation there. If you want to especially look at the two papers written in that book, Come Let Us Reason, very well sourced looking at the problems with zeitgeist, looking at the problems with these kind of things. And I would encourage you to go read them online and look at that. Really well-sourced documentation. But when we look at this and walk through this, let's talk a little bit about the story of Horus and the similarities, where again we're told that Christians stole the story of Jesus from Horus. Okay, so let's talk about that. Now, Horus is an Egyptian god around 3000 BC, so very old, very ancient. Horus is the child, and again, this is going to be a problem because remember, Jesus is born of a virgin. They claim Horus is born of a virgin. The problem with that is, and this is kind of a gross story, so I'm going to try to edit it as we go along. Horus's mother was Isis, and his father was her husband, Osiris. You can already see the problem there. Now, Osiris had an affair with the wife of another god named Set. And Set did not take kindly to this. And so Set kills Osiris and chops his body into 14 parts. Isis, Osiris' wife, uses her powers, her magic, her whatever, and she reassembles the body. So it's kind of a Frankenstein story. But she can't find all the parts. And the 14th part, the one that's missing, is, let's say it's the important part for making babies. Okay? So she fashions a replacement part and has intercourse with his dead, put back together body. And the result of that is Horus. Now, it should be pretty quickly noted that that's not a virgin birth story. It's a gross story. I mean, let's be honest. And it really doesn't have any similarity whatsoever. But let's keep going and let's see what the similarities are between the two. So Horus is the offspring of this. There's really no similarities again. There's no real resurrection story here for Osiris. Osiris ultimately heads off to the underworld and kind of rules the underworld, but he doesn't come back to life. It's not a resurrection story, anything like Jesus. Horus, there is no indication he was born on December the 25th. None whatsoever. And let's just set this December the 25th thing aside. No one has any idea where December the 25th came from, why it was picked. There are some theories out there, and we might talk about tonight, but there's no real connection to anything. December the 25th is not a date that is connected to anything by anybody's account. It's not Saturnalia. It's not anything else. It's just not. There's no ancient source documentation that points to that. Born of a virgin? No. I think we've covered that. Was there a star in the east marking his birth? There is no source for that. Was he adored by three kings? Jesus wasn't adored by three kings. That's one of these Hollywood things that we get wrong. The wise men who came from the east to find Jesus, nowhere does it say they were kings. We don't know how many of them there were. We know there's more than one because they were wise men, not a wise guy. But it could have been 2. It could have been 50. They brought 3 presents, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but nowhere in the Bible does it say there are 3 of them. So if Horus was adored by 3 kings, that's unique to Horus. It has nothing to do with Jesus. He was a teacher at 12. Again, no source. He had 12 disciples. No. He had 4 followers and 16 blacksmiths. I don't know where that comes from. He entered ministry at 30. Again, there's no mention, no source for that, no mention of baptism. There's this idea that he was crucified. There is literally no mention of him being crucified. There is a question about him being stung by a scorpion in some stories. He didn't die. He certainly wasn't crucified, and crucifixion did not exist when Horus was around in 3000 BC. Crucifixion was a much more modern invention. So he wasn't crucified, and let's be honest, that means he wasn't resurrected. There is literally no comparison between Horus and Jesus, none whatsoever. Mithra is the other one that gets a lot of popular play on the internet, and it's the same thing. I love this. Born of a virgin. No, he actually materialized out of a rock, fully grown, fully dressed. Again, no mention of December the 25th. Nobody is born December the 25th. Horus, the only dates for Horus are given are July and August. There is no December date. He did not have 12 disciples. He never died and was resurrected. There are no ancient sources for any of this. Again, this is one of these questions. The people who claim that there are need to produce good source documentation for that, and there is no source documentation for it. There just isn't. There's no ancient source documentation for it. And a lot of these things came out of the explosive growth of Christianity. So in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, you see a lot of similar claims starting to come out of some of these cult worshippers that happened following Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, but not before. And in the case of Mithra and in the case of Horus, there are no ancient sources that support any real similarities between them and Jesus. There just aren't any. This whole idea of Saturnalia. Saturnalia is December the 17th, and it did extend into a longer time period, but it never extended as far out as December the 25th. There's no connection between Saturnalia and the 25th of December. If you actually go back through and look, and again, I'd point you to Mike Wingert's stuff on this, Saturnalia actually reads more like the Purge than it does Christmas. I mean, the stuff that goes on with rape and sexual immorality, drunkenness, revelry, and human sacrifices and things like that, it is a day of totally letting go and totally just doing all sorts of awful things. There is no connection between Saturnalia and Christianity and Christmas whatsoever. And this is one of those things that has been popularized on the internet. There's just no truth in it. And I don't really know how to spend any more time on it or look at it, because it's really hard to roll up your sleeves and debate something that's not even close. The closest thing you've got is Saturnalia being in the month of December, I guess. But that's it. There's no real good indicators as to why December the 25th was picked by the ancient church back in, and it was picked in that time period around Constantine and things like that, and that part's true. But there's no good indication as to why it was picked, and it certainly isn't connected to any pagan's holiday of any significance. There doesn't seem to be any connection. I guess it also probably briefly warrants mentioning, the Da Vinci Code was probably one of the first ones that put Constantine on the map as being kind of the ancient Don Corleone of mystery, of all these conspiracy theories, that somehow Constantine came in and changed Jesus from just being a man into being a god. And all of these horrible things happened at the Council of Nicaea, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. Now, none of them actually go so far as to say that Jesus didn't exist. But again, Constantine gets a horrible bad rap from history. The Bible was established, the books of the Bible were established and completed long before Constantine came around. I think there's something like 48 different Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have in existence from before Constantine took power. So before the 4th century. And you can reassemble about half of the New Testament. None of them complete, all of them are fragmentary. But you can reassemble about half of the New Testament with copies that old. And none of them have been changed. None of them have changed Jesus from being a normal guy into a god. There's none of that. What went on at the Council of Nicaea is pretty straightforward, and those documents are out there. They didn't walk in there thinking Jesus was a man and suddenly leave believing that Jesus was a god. The question at Nicaea wasn't Jesus' godhood. The question was, how do you describe it? And I'm going to be honest, as a Christian today, it's not easy to describe that. The idea of Jesus being fully man and fully God, it's difficult to put into words. It's difficult even for us today to describe it. And that's what Nicaea was working on. I love this quote from the book Reinventing Jesus. And again, I'll put it in source document at the end. But I love this quote talking about what went on at the Council of Nicaea and this idea that Constantine could have possibly held a lot of influence over these people. The early Christians back in this day were heavily, heavily persecuted prior to Constantine. And they had survived the persecution of the emperors before him. And this idea that Constantine being nice to them somehow could have swayed them over is just ridiculous to this point. The bishops at Nicaea were more accustomed to persecution rather than pampering. Many of them had lived through the injustices of emperors Diocletian, who was ruled from 284 to 305 AD, and Maximin, ruling from 286 to 305 AD. Diocletian was eager to confiscate Christian writings, burn Christian buildings, and arrest Christian clergy. Maximin didn't hesitate to execute, disable, or exile those who refused to renounce Christ. At least one of the bishops at Nicaea had personally experienced Maximin's cruelty. I can't pronounce this guy's name. Paphinitus lost his right eye and gained a limp in his left leg before being banished to the mines as a result of confessing his faith. There were more victims of persecution at the hands of others. Some lost the use of their fingers because their nerves had been seared with hot pokers. Still others lost limbs altogether. The marks of persecution were so prevalent that one ancient writer said, this is again about the church at the Council of Nicaea, the council looked like an assembled army of martyrs. Of course, men who suffered such physical injuries for the sake of spiritual integrity were not about to be told what they should believe about Christ, imperial pressure or not. And that's very true. Nothing happened at the Council of Nicaea that changed the course of Christianity from what had already been set out. And I think this is probably a good place to wrap things up and end this week. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Again, a lot of these ideas are just wild conspiracy theories that don't have any basis in fact whatsoever. Next week, we're going to look at the two different accounts of the Christmas story and see, can they be brought together? Do they fit with each other, or do they contradict each other in such a way that they just absolutely blow each other apart? As always, you can find our podcasts out on YouTube. And if you like this week's episode, I hope you'll hit the like button and consider subscribing to our podcast. I love to reach out to you every time we release a new episode. You can also find us on iTunes and Spotify, and you can find us on our website at prooftograce.com. You can reach out to us via email at proof2grace@yahoo.com if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and I cannot wait to complete this journey with you on Christmas morning. Have a good week. Bye-bye.